Imagine a winter so cold, trains froze on the tracks, streets disappeared under snow, and even the simplest daily tasks became a struggle tonight. We step into Britain's frozen months of 1947, one of the harshest winters in living memory. Stay with me, and together we'll uncover how ordinary people endured endless snow, coal shortages, and weeks of bitter frost. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calming journeys through history. The winter of 1947 in Britain has often been remembered as one of the most severe and testing periods of the 20th century. The memory of that season has not only endured in weather records, but also in the recollections of those who lived through it. For many, it was more than a matter of climate. It was a struggle against isolation, shortage, and the relentless grip of nature at a time when the country was still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. To understand how the frozen months began, we must step carefully into the first weeks of that year, when the snow started to fall, quietly at first, and then with an unyielding persistence that reshaped daily life. Britain in early 1947 was weary but determined. Only 2 years had passed since the end of the war, and while the guns had fallen silent, the echoes of conflict lingered in the form of rationed books, bomb-damaged streets, and a national economy still fragile from years of strain. Families counted their allowances carefully, stretching limited supplies of food, clothing, and fuel as best they could. Coal, which had heated homes and powered industries for generations, remained under strict regulation. It was rationed and distributed according to set allocations. And while in ordinary winters this was already a challenge, in the face of extraordinary cold, it became a matter of survival. The first signs of trouble appeared in late January. Weather forecasts mentioned falling temperatures, but few anticipated what was to come. Light snow began to drift across southern counties, brushing over rooftops and softening the edges of hedgerows. At first, the scenes were picturesque. Children ran into gardens to catch flakes on their mittens, and towns appeared briefly transformed into postcard images of winter calm. Shopkeepers swept doorways clear each morning, and commuters pulled scarves tightly around their faces as they hurried to work through the crisp air. Yet as days turned into weeks, the snow did not thaw. Instead, it deepened. By the first week of February, a steady pattern had formed. Each evening brought a sharp frost that hardened the ground, and each morning revealed another layer of white. In cities such as London, Manchester, and Birmingham, pavements became slick with ice. Residents walked carefully, boots crunching on packed snow, their breath rising in steady clouds. In villages, narrow lanes disappeared under drifts that grew higher with each passing storm. For many households, doorsteps had to be dug out daily, and windowsills froze so thickly that daylight seemed filtered through glassy frost. Transportation was among the first systems to falter. Britain's railways, essential for moving coal, food, and passengers, were unprepared for the scale of the snowfall. Tracks vanished beneath heaps of snow several feet deep, and points and switches froze solid. Railway workers, wrapped in heavy coats, labored with shovels and picks to clear lines, often only to find them buried again the next morning. Trains were delayed or canceled outright, stranding passengers and slowing the delivery of critical supplies. In some rural regions, rail links stopped altogether, leaving villages cut off from the outside world except for what could be carried by horse-drawn cart or on foot. Road transport fared little better. Lorries attempting to deliver goods to towns and cities found themselves stuck on ice-covered hills or unable to pass snow-blocked routes. Buses crept along at a fraction of their normal speed, windows fogged from the combined breath of passengers huddled in thick coats. In more remote areas, roads disappeared entirely, marked only by the faint impression of telegraph poles standing above a uniform sea of white. In the countryside, the hardships deepened swiftly. Farmers, who relied on regular access to feed and markets, were faced with daunting tasks. Sheep, often grazing on open hillsides, became trapped beneath drifts. Stories emerged of entire flocks buried alive, with only faint movements betraying their presence under the snow. Cattle, confined to barns, suffered in the cold as supplies of fodder dwindled. Farmers and their families braved fierce winds to haul hay by sled or hand, forcing paths through snow that reached their waists. Even when feed was delivered, water supplies often froze, requiring animals to be given ice to lick in place of liquid water. In towns, the atmosphere shifted from novelty to endurance. At first, children welcomed the endless snow, fashioning sledges from makeshift boards or sliding down icy slopes created by frozen streets. Snowball fights broke out in schoolyards, and laughter echoed briefly in neighborhoods otherwise subdued by the cold. But as the weeks dragged on, joy gave way to discomfort. Families awoke each morning to kitchens so cold that water in the sink had frozen overnight. Bedrooms were chilled to the point where frost decorated the inside of window panes in delicate crystals. Many homes were heated by a single small fire, often confined to the main living room, while the rest of the house remained bitterly cold. People wore their outdoor coats indoors, layered blankets on beds, and even resorted to sleeping in shifts near the hearth for warmth. Fuel scarcity was a daily trial. Coal deliveries, already limited by rationing, became even less reliable as transport ground to a halt. The Ministry of Fuel and Power issued warnings of shortages, urging citizens to conserve every lump of coal. Newspapers carried notices reminding readers to keep fires as small as possible, to block drafts, and to use hot water bottles to preserve warmth in beds. In some districts, the government organized emergency allocations, but these were never sufficient to meet need. Many households burned whatever they could find: old furniture, scrap wood, even books that were no longer needed. Shops also struggled to remain stocked. Rationing ensured some degree of fairness, but when deliveries were disrupted, queues formed quickly outside bakeries, grocers, and butchers. Residents stood in line for hours in the freezing cold, stamping their feet to keep warm, their ration books in hand. When supplies finally arrived, the relief was palpable, though the shelves never offered abundance. For many, the simple acquisition of bread or a small amount of tea became the highlight of the week. The press played an important role in shaping public perception of the crisis. Newspapers ran dramatic photographs of snow-laden streets, stranded trains, and icicles hanging from rooftops. Yet alongside these images were stories of resilience. Communities working together to dig out neighbors, volunteers delivering supplies to the elderly, and children cheering as they helped clear paths. The media reminded readers that Britain had faced hardships before and would endure again. Editorials drew comparisons with wartime resilience, framing the winter as another test of national character. Still, morale was fragile. The war had left scars both physical and emotional, and many found it difficult to summon further endurance. Letters to local councils and members of parliament expressed frustration over fuel shortages and transport failures. Some households, already weakened by years of rationing, felt the cold as more than an inconvenience. It became a threat to health. Reports of illness rose, particularly respiratory conditions such as bronchitis and pneumonia. Hospitals, struggling with their own heating problems, did what they could, but the strain was immense. Amidst the severity, small acts of daily life continued, albeit with adjustment. Schools remained open when possible, though attendance often dropped as children were unable to reach classrooms through blocked roads. Churches, community halls, and libraries provided gathering places where fires could be lit, offering a few hours of relative comfort. Weddings still took place, brides and grooms photographed against snowy backdrops, their breath visible in the icy air. Life did not stop, but it slowed, reshaped by necessity and caution. By mid-February, It had become clear that this was no ordinary winter. Meteorologists confirmed that the country was experiencing one of the coldest periods on record. The persistence of snow, combined with strong easterly winds, created drifts that engulfed entire buildings. Rural postmen spoke of delivering letters through tunnels carved in snowbanks. Farmers described barns buried up to the roofline. Urban residents reported that even the sound of the city seemed muted, the usual clatter of traffic replaced by the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional creak of ice-laden branches snapping under their own weight. This was only the beginning. The first snowfalls, gentle though they appeared, set the stage for weeks of deepening hardship. Britain was entering not just a winter, but a season of endurance unlike any seen for generations. In the chapters that follow, we will trace how this cold deepened, how shortages grew more acute, and how communities adapted to survive Britain's frozen months of 1947. The story of Britain's winter of 1947 cannot be told without coal. In that age, coal was more than a commodity. It was the foundation of modern life. It powered the trains, kept factories alive, and, most importantly, warmed the millions of homes spread across towns, cities, and villages. Without coal, the daily rhythm of Britain faltered, and in the frozen months of early 1947, coal ran short. To appreciate the depth of the crisis, one must remember how dependent the nation was on this single resource. Electricity was available in many urban areas, but much of it was generated by burning coal. Gas stoves, where they existed, were often tied to coal-based production. Most households relied on coal fires for warmth, whether in small grates in terraced houses or larger hearths in country cottages. In the industrial regions of northern England, Wales, and Scotland, coal dust itself was familiar, a fine layer that settled on window ledges and washing lines. A reminder of the mines that kept Britain's heart beating. That be why the late 1940s, coal mining was undergoing change. In 1946, the industry had been nationalized, brought under state ownership with the creation of the National Coal Board. Optimism had surrounded the move. It was hoped that better organization, investment, and planning would secure steady supplies for decades to come. But the winter of 1947 exposed the fragile nature of those hopes. Severe weather closed mines, blocked transport, and created a surge in demand at precisely the moment when supply was most vulnerable. As the snow deepened in February, coal deliveries slowed to a crawl. Railway wagons stood idle in frozen sidings. Trains that did run often could not reach their destinations, halted by drifts that swallowed tracks. In ports, ships bearing imported coal found unloading impossible as harbors iced over. Lorries, which might have carried emergency supplies, skidded on glassy roads or became stuck behind walls of snow. Across the land, the great network that usually carried coal from pithead to hearth became entangled and silent. Inside homes, the shortage was felt almost immediately. Families who had relied on their weekly sack of coal found that deliveries grew smaller or failed to arrive at all. Fires dwindled from bright flames to smoldering embers. Some households restricted heating to a single room, often the kitchen, where life gathered close to the stove. Others allowed the fire to die altogether, wrapping themselves in coats, scarves, and extra blankets, even indoors. Frost grew thick on the inside of windows, and in unheated bedrooms, sheets were so cold that people hesitated before climbing into bed. Memoirs of the time recall the strange silence of those rooms. Without the crackle of coal, without the steady pulse of warmth, houses felt hollow. Children complained of numb fingers as they tried to do homework. Parents worried about illness, for bronchitis and pneumonia flourished in the damp chill. The elderly, already fragile after years of wartime deprivation, suffered most of all. Neighbors often checked on one another, offering a place by their fire if they had coal to spare, or sharing news of which merchant might still have a few sacks left. The government faced mounting pressure. Emmanuel Shinwell, The Minister of Fuel and Power became a central figure in the public eye. Newspapers carried his announcements daily, urging conservation, promising that supplies were being redirected, and assuring readers that relief was on its way. Yet frustration grew. Letters poured in from citizens complaining of empty coal bunkers, of children shivering, of factories forced to shut down. Political opponents seized on the crisis as evidence of mismanagement. For many, the shortage was more than an inconvenience. It was a breach of trust, for the state had promised warmth and security after the hardships of war. Industries suffered deeply. Coal did not only heat homes. It powered the machinery of recovery. Steelworks, textile mills, and engineering plants all required steady fuel. As stocks dwindled, managers had little choice but to reduce hours or close entirely. By mid-February, thousands of workers found themselves temporarily laid off. Wages dropped, and communities that had only just begun to rebuild after the war were again thrown into uncertainty. The hum of industry, usually a constant presence in towns like Sheffield, Cardiff, or Glasgow, faded into uneasy quiet. Electricity, too, became unreliable. With power stations unable to secure steady coal supplies, the government introduced restrictions. Street lighting was reduced or extinguished entirely, plunging urban centers into early darkness. Radio broadcasts, one of the chief forms of home entertainment, were curtailed to save power. Cinemas closed on certain days, their screens dark as projectors sat idle. Even factories that might have continued on limited coal found their electricity cut without warning. The result was a strange stillness. Cities dimmed, workplaces silent, households gathered around fading fires. People adapted in creative, sometimes desperate, ways. Furniture was dismantled for burning. Chairs and tables sacrificed piece by piece to keep a fire alive for another evening. Wooden fences were stripped, leaving open gaps along gardens and fields. Old newspapers were rolled tightly into makeshift logs, though they burned quickly and gave little heat. Some families turned to peat, if they could dig it, or collected fallen branches from parks. In urban centers, there were reports of theft, coal disappearing from depots, wagons raided at night, sacks stolen from doorsteps before families could carry them inside. The psychological impact was significant. For a nation already enduring rationing of food, clothing, and everyday goods, the absence of coal felt like one burden too many. The cold penetrated not only walls, but spirits. Diaries from the time record feelings of exhaustion, of endless waiting for warmth that never quite came. Mothers wrote of children crying themselves to sleep because their feet ached from cold. Fathers described the helplessness of arriving home from work to find their families huddled together, their breath visible in the darkened room. Yet there were also stories of resilience. Communities organized soup kitchens and church halls, where large stoves could warm both food and bodies. Schools, when open, sometimes gathered children in the assembly hall around a single heater rather than dispersing them into icy classrooms. Neighbors invited the elderly to spend evenings in the one room they managed to keep warm. The sharing of warmth, as much as the sharing of food, became a communal act. The press reflected this duality. On one hand, sharp criticism of the government, and on the other, celebration of stoicism. The Dunkirk spirit, invoked during the war, was once again suggested as a model. If Britain had endured the Blitz, it could endure the snow. Editorials urged patience, restraint, and cooperation. Still, photographs of men and women queuing with coal scuttles in hand, waiting for meager rations from merchant yards, painted a sobering picture. By late February, the situation reached its lowest point. Supplies in some regions dropped to less than a day's worth. Factories announced extended closures. Hospitals issued warnings about their ability to maintain heat in wards. Parliament held emergency debates, and Shinwell faced fierce questioning. For many citizens, however, Politics mattered less than the immediate challenge of how to light tomorrow's fire. The turning point came slowly, as weather patterns began to shift. March brought no sudden thaw, but a gradual easing of the cold. Transport lines reopened inch by inch, railways cleared by relentless crews, roads plowed and salted as best they could be. Coal, once again, began to move. Deliveries resumed, faltering at first, but growing more reliable. Fires burned brighter, though memories of the bitter weeks remained sharp. Looking back, the coal shortage of 1947 became one of the defining features of that winter. It revealed the vulnerability of a modern nation dependent on a single fuel. It tested the organization of a newly nationalized industry and the resolve of a people who had hoped for relief after years of war. Above all, it showed how intimately daily comfort and survival were tied to the simple act of feeding a fire. The shortage was not merely an economic issue. It was a social experience, etched into memory as the weeks when warmth itself seemed rationed more tightly than any food. Families who lived through it remembered the feel of frozen sheets, the smell of damp clothing drying slowly by a weak fire, the sound of silence in rooms where a hearth should have crackled. For them, the winter of 1947 was not measured only in inches of snow, but in shovelfuls of coal that never arrived. When the winter of 1947 deepened, Britain's great towns and cities, usually alive with movement and noise, slowed into a strange, uneasy quiet. For weeks on end, snow and frost muffled the familiar rhythms of daily life. Factories closed their doors, streets emptied earlier each evening, and the hum of modern life fell into stillness. People spoke often of the cold, but it was the silence that left its mark. The silence of Britain's towns became a defining memory of those frozen months. To understand the silence, one must first imagine the towns as they were in ordinary times. Post-war Britain was not yet the bustling, brightly lit landscape of later decades, but it was still full of life. Street markets sold fruit and vegetables, trams rattled past rows of terraced houses, and railway stations clattered with passengers and porters. Evenings were lit by street lamps. Cinemas showed films to packed audiences, and public houses spilled voices into the night air. The sounds of machinery echoed from textile mills, ironworks, and shipyards, while children filled schoolyards with shouts and laughter. Then came the snow. Heavy drifts blocked streets, clogged tram lines, and blanketed rooftops. The usual noise of wheels and hooves on cobblestones was smothered. Deliveries that normally rattled down alleyways were delayed or canceled, and markets thinned as lorries failed to arrive with produce. Soon after, the coal shortage and government restrictions on electricity added a second layer of silence. Without power, machinery stood idle. The clatter of industry ceased. Radios, silenced by limited broadcasts, no longer poured music and voices into kitchens. Even cinemas dimmed their screens, closing on days when electricity was restricted. The silence was not absolute. Snowploughs groaned now and then. Boots crunched on frozen pavements, and children still laughed on sledges in public parks. But the overall impression, recalled in countless memoirs, was one of unusual stillness. In the evenings, cities fell into darkness earlier than anyone remembered. Streetlights, cut to save fuel, left neighborhoods dim, their outlines barely visible beneath low clouds. Shops closed early to conserve heating, sending workers home to houses where only a single room might hold warmth. By 6 or 7 o'clock, many streets were deserted, their snow-packed surfaces glowing faintly under the moon. Inside homes, life contracted around the fire, or what remained of it. Families gathered in kitchens or parlors, blocking drafts with blankets and newspapers, sitting close together to conserve heat. The radio, usually the background sound of domestic life, often fell silent as broadcasts were shortened and electricity failed. Neighbors who might once have called for a visit thought twice before braving icy steps or darkened alleys. Thus, even indoors, the sense of quiet was profound. People read by candlelight, knitted scarves for children, or simply sat in silence, listening to the creak of timbers as frost gripped the walls. For children, the silence was sometimes magical. They remembered the way snow softened every corner of their town, transforming familiar places into white wonderlands. Streets once filled with traffic became playgrounds where they could slide, sledge, or build fortresses of packed ice. The muffled air made even their shouts seem strange, as if carried into distance more slowly. For adults, though, the same quiet carried unease. It spoke of inactivity, of shortages, of time suspended. The nation that had been urged to rebuild after war found itself waiting. Unable to move forward while snow and frost held power, industry's stillness was perhaps the most striking. Mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire closed when power was cut. Looms and machines that usually thundered through the day stood motionless, their belts and gears stiffened by frost. Steelworks cooled, furnaces reduced to embers. Shipyards where riveters once hammered metal plates into place lay frozen, their cranes unmoving against gray skies. The silence of industry was more than acoustic. It meant wages lost, production halted, and morale shaken. Workers who walked each morning to locked gates carried home not just cold fingers, but also uncertainty for their families. Shops, too, grew quiet. With rationing already limiting supplies, the additional disruption of deliveries left counters bare. Customers queued quietly, stamping their feet in the snow, waiting for bread or tea. Inside, grocers apologized for empty shelves, and butchers offered what little they had. Where markets survived, their usual clamor was muted. The cries of vendors were fewer, their stalls reduced to a handful of goods. Money changed hands slowly, with customers aware that tomorrow might bring nothing at all. The government's voice filled part of the silence. Each morning, newspapers carried official announcements, and the radio broadcast statements from ministers. Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power, became a familiar name in households across Britain, though not always a welcome one. His reassurances that coal would soon arrive rang hollow to those staring at an empty grate. Parliamentary debates were printed in detail, yet for ordinary people, they were read in kitchens so cold that hands stiffened on the page. The government's voice filled the space once occupied by the bustle of life, but it was not enough to break the silence. The silence of towns also carried a psychological weight. People spoke of the eerie calm when walking home in the evenings. Without cars or buses, the only sound was the occasional crunch of boots on snow. Without electric lights, windows glowed faintly from candles or oil lamps, their yellow circles small against the dark. For some, it felt as if the world had shrunk, reduced to the distance one could see or the room one could keep warm. For others, it brought memories of wartime blackouts, though then, the silence was broken by the fear of bombers overhead. Now, it was broken only by the wind. There were, however, small moments of community that softened the quiet. In some districts, neighbors gathered in one another's homes, pooling what fuel and light they had to share warmth. Children from several houses played together in snowbound courtyards, their laughter a welcome sound in the hush. Churches, libraries, and community halls sometimes opened their doors for warmth, offering soup or hot tea where they could. These gatherings filled the silence with conversation, though always against the backdrop of cold and uncertainty. The press captured both sides of the experience. Photographs showed empty streets, chimneys without smoke, and queues of people waiting silently for coal deliveries. But they also showed children skating on frozen ponds, families pulling sledges piled with groceries, and neighbors digging out a street together. The silence of the towns was thus double-edged, heavy with hardship, yet sometimes softened by resilience. The memory of those silent weeks stayed with people long after the snow melted. Older generations spoke of the way sound seemed to vanish, leaving even large towns strangely muted. They remembered the crunch of boots, the faint hiss of a match as it lit a candle, the distant scrape of shovels clearing paths. They recalled lying awake at night, hearing only the ticking of a clock and the occasional drip of water from a thawing pipe. For those who lived through it, the winter of 1947 was not only a season of cold, it was a season of quiet. Silence can shape memory as much as noise. In the towns of Britain during that frozen winter, the absence of sound became a presence of its own. It was the quiet of factories without power, of shops without goods, of homes without coal. It was the quiet of streets covered in snow, of nights without light, of families huddled close around fading fires. It was the quiet of a nation waiting for warmth, for spring, for life to resume its ordinary rhythm. And so, as Britain endured the frozen months, the silence of its towns stood as one of the clearest reminders of how fragile the patterns of modern life could be when nature pressed its weight upon them. The stillness lingered long after the snow had gone, etched into memory as part of the story of the winter of 1947. When the Great Freeze of 1947 swept across Britain, its impact was felt in every corner of the nation, from the crowded cities to the smallest hamlets. But nowhere did the struggle become more immediate and more visible than in the countryside. Farms, the very places responsible for feeding the nation, found themselves trapped beneath heavy snow. In a season already marked by rationing and shortages, the difficulties faced by farmers were particularly severe. Their fields disappeared, their animals were stranded, and their routines, already demanding, became tests of endurance unlike any they had known. Agriculture had carried a heavy responsibility in post-war Britain. During the Second World War, farmers had been called upon to increase production dramatically, plowing up grasslands, extending crop acreage, and ensuring that food imports, vulnerable to submarine attack, could be supplemented by domestic harvests. By 1947, although peace had returned, rationing remained strict. Britons still queued for their weekly allowances of bread, meat, fats, and sugar. Every egg, every gallon of milk, every sack of potatoes produced on British farms mattered. And so, when snow fell endlessly across fields and pastures, it was not only a local inconvenience, it was a national concern. The first challenge was simple visibility. Drifts piled so high that fields vanished from sight. Hedgerows, fences, and even stone walls disappeared under shifting white ridges. Farmers stepping out from their doorways in the morning often found barns half-buried, gateways blocked, and paths erased. Livestock grazed in open pastures until snow covered the grass. Then they became trapped. Stories spread of entire flocks of sheep swallowed by drifts, their muffled bleating barely audible beneath the frozen surface. Farmers and shepherds dug desperately with shovels, their hands raw from cold, trying to uncover animals before suffocation or starvation claimed them. In some cases, dozens, even hundreds, were lost in a single storm. Cattle faced equal hardship. Winter fodder had been stored in barns and stacks, but reaching it became a daily ordeal. Tractors, where they existed, were rendered useless by deep snow and frozen fuel. Horses, more reliable in such conditions, strained against sledges loaded with hay, but even they could falter in drifts higher than their backs. Farmers, their wives, and even children joined in the labor, carrying bales of straw or hay by hand, staggering through knee or waist-deep snow to reach hungry animals. Many recalled in later years the sound of lowing cattle, desperate for food and warmth, echoing across fields muffled by snow. Water, too, became scarce. Streams froze solid, and troughs were covered with inches of ice. Farmers carried axes to break through, often more than once a day. In some districts, animals survived by licking at snow, but this was no substitute for proper watering. The daily care of livestock became an unending cycle, digging out paths, hauling feed, chopping ice, checking shelters, and repeating the process as the snow closed in again overnight. For arable farmers, the situation was no less dire. Fields lay buried, and though crops were not due until spring, preparations were halted. Fertilizer deliveries stalled, and seed potatoes, stored in clamps, were at risk of freezing if coverings failed. Machinery rusted in sheds where doors were frozen shut. Men who might have plowed or repaired hedges found themselves instead wielding shovels to clear farmyards. Every task slowed, and every hour of labor demanded twice the strength. The human toll was heavy. Farmhouses, often isolated, felt more cut off than ever. Families rose before dawn to tend animals, returning at night with clothing stiff from frozen sweat. Women worked alongside men, milking cows in parlors so cold that fingers cracked, or boiling water in kettles balanced over small fires to keep newborn calves alive. Children were expected to help, fetching kindling, carrying water, or herding animals into shelter. Education sometimes paused, for schools were unreachable, and so young people became full participants in the work of survival. Despite these hardships, there was little choice but to continue. Farmers knew that their efforts fed not only their own households, but millions of others. Milk had to reach collection points, even if churns were dragged by sled through snowbound lanes. Eggs had to be gathered, even if hens huddled miserably in half-frozen coops. Potatoes and root vegetables had to be dug from clamps, despite the frost hardening the soil. If deliveries could not be made, local distribution took place informally. Neighbors shared what they had, or small amounts were carried on foot to village shops. Government ministers were acutely aware of the crisis in the countryside. Reports reached London of sheep buried alive, of farmers losing entire herds, of milk uncollected and wasted. The Ministry of Agriculture issued appeals for assistance, and in some areas, military units were dispatched to help dig out farms or clear roads. Tractors were sometimes fitted with improvised plows to open routes. In the most desperate situations, supplies were dropped by air, an extraordinary sight in rural Britain, where planes circling low over fields scattered bales of hay to stranded flocks. The press documented these scenes with vivid detail. Newspapers carried photographs of farmers standing beside walls of snow higher than their heads, of cattle being led through narrow trenches carved by shovels, of soldiers hauling sacks of feed to remote barns. Yet alongside the hardships, there were images of resilience. Smiling children riding atop hay bales, neighbors working shoulder to shoulder, farmers pausing with steaming mugs of tea in the brief warmth of a kitchen before returning to the drifts. Economically, the losses were severe. Sheep farmers in particular suffered devastating blows. Thousands of animals perished, representing not only immediate loss of meat and wool, but also long-term damage to flocks carefully bred over years. Dairy farmers saw milk production plummet, with cows underfed and water supplies uncertain. Poultry flocks dwindled as feed ran short and cold weakened birds. For a country already struggling with rationing, every animal lost represented food denied to the nation. And yet, despite the setbacks, the countryside adapted in remarkable ways. Farmers who lost stock resolved to rebuild. Communities organized cooperative efforts, sharing equipment, manpower, and even feed where possible. Parish councils sometimes coordinated relief, ensuring that the most isolated farms were visited and supported. There was frustration, exhaustion, and sometimes despair, but there was also determination. Daily life on farms took on a rhythm shaped entirely by the snow. Morning began with the sound of boots crunching across frozen yards, followed by the scrape of shovels clearing paths to barns. Midday might bring a brief pause for tea, steam rising from mugs clutched in gloved hands. Afternoon meant more hauling of feed, more chopping of ice, more checking of animals for signs of frostbite or illness. Evening came with fatigue, but also with the satisfaction of having kept livestock alive another day. The work never ceased, yet within its monotony lay a sense of purpose. Children growing up in those months remembered both the hardship and the wonder. They spoke of sledging down farm tracks, of icicles hanging like spears from barn roofs, of snow caves dug into drifts taller than themselves. But they also remembered carrying buckets until their arms ached, of fingers so numb that they struggled to hold a pencil when school resumed, of parents who looked perpetually tired but refused to stop. For them, the winter of 1947 became a lesson in endurance, one that would be retold across generations. As March approached, relief came slowly. Snow still covered fields, but thaws began to show dark patches of earth. Roads reopened, allowing feed lorries to reach farms once more. Milk collection resumed more regularly, though production remained below normal. Sheep were found alive beneath drifts weeks after storms, weak but breathing. Farmers took stock of their losses, calculating how much of their livelihood had survived. The silence of fields was broken again by the lowing of cattle and the bark of dogs freed from snowbound kennels. The legacy of that winter for British agriculture was profound. It revealed the vulnerability of farms to extreme weather, the need for better contingency planning, and the resilience of rural communities. Many farmers spoke of it for the rest of their lives, measuring every later winter against the standards set in 1947. To younger generations, it became almost a legend, the year when the snow buried fields, when families fought to save their animals, when the countryside itself seemed locked in a struggle with nature. Above all, the image that endured was one of farms under snow, barns half buried, sheep dug out by hand, cattle fed with hay hauled through waist-high drifts, families gathered around small fires after endless hours of toil. It was an image of hardship, but also of perseverance. And it was part of the larger story of how Britain, in that frozen year, learned again the strength of its ordinary people. Food has always been one of the most immediate concerns during any crisis, and in the frozen winter of 1947, it became a daily challenge that shaped every household in Britain. The struggle for food was not new. The nation had lived with rationing since the dark years of the war. But the endless snowfalls and the disruption of transport created a new level of hardship. Queues grew longer, shelves emptier, and the simple act of preparing a family meal became a test of patience, ingenuity, and endurance. To understand the depth of this struggle, one must recall the rationing system in place at the time. Britain had introduced food rationing during the war to ensure fair distribution and to stretch supplies strained by submarine attacks on shipping. By 1947, even 2 years after peace, rationing remained a central part of life. Meat, butter, sugar, tea, and many other items were strictly controlled. Each citizen carried a ration book, with coupons carefully counted and torn out by shopkeepers at every purchase. This system worked reasonably well under normal circumstances, but it depended on steady deliveries of goods. When transport broke down under snow and coal shortages closed mills, the system faltered. In towns and villages, the familiar weekly trip to the grocer or the butcher became an ordeal. Snow blocked deliveries, leaving counters bare. Shop windows, once filled with modest displays of bread, biscuits, or tinned goods, showed only empty shelves or hastily written signs. No bread today, or potatoes unavailable. Customers stood in line anyway, clutching ration books, hoping that something, anything, might arrive before the day ended. The silence of those queues was memorable. People waited with stoic patience, breath rising in clouds, stamping their feet to keep warm. Conversations were brief, often about rumors of a delivery coming from a nearby town, or about which shops still had a little flour left. Bread was among the most crucial items. In July 1946, bread itself had been rationed for the first time in British history, and by 1947 this restriction was still in place. Bakeries worked hard to produce the regulated national loaf, a grayish, wholemeal bread designed to be nutritious but never popular. When snow stopped flour deliveries, bakeries simply closed their doors. Families cut stale slices thin, toasted them carefully by the fire if they had fuel, or made soups and stews stretch with crumbs. Children, accustomed to eating bread at nearly every meal, felt its absence keenly. Potatoes, usually a reliable staple, became scarce as well. The snow-buried fields and even stored supplies were difficult to transport. Reports emerged of families eating little more than turnips or swedes, vegetables that could withstand the cold. In some rural communities, people dug through snow to unearth what they could, grateful for any root that could be boiled or mashed. City dwellers, dependent on deliveries, had fewer options. Letters to newspapers expressed anxiety about the lack of potatoes, with mothers writing that their children had grown tired of endless carrots or parsnips in their place. Milk posed another difficulty. Dairy farmers struggled to keep cattle fed and watered, and when milk was produced, collection lorries often failed to reach farms. Churns stood frozen at the roadside, while in towns, families queued at dairies only to be told supplies had not arrived. Powdered milk became more common, though many disliked its taste. Mothers of young children worried constantly, for milk was considered vital for growth and health. In some districts, emergency measures allowed local distribution by hand, with farmers delivering small amounts directly to neighbors, but this was patchwork at best. Meat, already scarce due to rationing, grew scarcer still. Slaughterhouses could not function properly when transport of animals was halted. Farmers who lost sheep and cattle to snow had nothing to send to market. Butchers opened their shops with only a few cuts available, sometimes nothing more than offal or bones. Families made stews from scraps, eking out flavor with vegetables or barley. The arrival of a single joint of beef or pork, rare indeed, was a cause for excitement, but few families could expect such luxury. Fish, which might have supplemented the diet, was unreliable as well. Fishing ports froze, and boats were unable to sail. Even when catches arrived, icy roads meant they spoiled before reaching inland towns. Eggs, too, were difficult to come by, for hens laid less in cold weather and feed was scarce. Powdered eggs, distributed through rationing, were disliked but accepted as necessary. Housewives stirred them into puddings or scrambled them carefully, though the flavor never matched that of fresh. For families, meal planning became an art of substitution. Mothers and grandmothers, already experienced in stretching small rations, became even more inventive. Leftover vegetables were turned into soups, thickened with barley or oats. Stale bread became breadcrumbs, puddings, or fillers for meat. Carrots, abundant when other foods failed, were grated into cakes, stewed with syrup, or sliced thin to mimic scarce fruits. Wartime cookery, as it had been called, was still very much in practice. Yet in 1947, it was made harder by the sheer lack of ingredients. The psychological strain was as heavy as the physical one. Food had long been more than sustenance. It was a marker of comfort, of family unity, of ordinary life. Sitting down to a proper meal reminded people of stability, of traditions carried through generations. In 1947, many families found their tables bare or their meals repetitive to the point of despair. Children grew tired of turnip soup, of barley porridge, of the same stewed carrots night after night. Parents worried not only about nutrition, but about morale. A warm meal could lift spirits, but only if it was available. The press documented the shortages with both urgency and restraint. Newspapers reported on empty shelves, queues stretching down streets, and the frustration of housewives. Yet they also published recipes, tips, and encouragements, urging citizens to make do and keep faith. Photographs showed women carrying baskets through snowdrifts, shopkeepers serving small portions with apologetic expressions, and children peering into windows hoping for sweets. Radio broadcasts carried official reassurances, but to many listeners huddled in cold kitchens, these words felt distant from their daily reality that in the countryside. The situation was somewhat different. Farmers often had small reserves of food, eggs, milk, vegetables, but faced the problem of getting them to market. Roads blocked by snow left surplus produce unused while townspeople went hungry. This mismatch frustrated many, and stories circulated of villages where milk spoiled for lack of collection, even as urban families went without. The government attempted to coordinate better distribution, sometimes using military vehicles to carry supplies. But such efforts could never cover the whole country at once. The black market, which had existed throughout the war, remained active. In back alleys and quiet corners, goods changed hands at high prices: bread, butter, even chocolate. For those with money, it was a way to secure luxuries, but most families could not afford it. Authorities condemned such practices, yet they persisted, a reminder that scarcity often breeds inequality. Despite all difficulties, communities found ways to endure. Neighbors shared food when they could, sending bowls of stew across fences or baking extra loaves when flour was available. Schools sometimes provided hot meals for children, using whatever supplies they could gather. Churches and charities organized communal kitchens, where families could find warmth as well as a meal. These gatherings, modest though they were, gave people a sense of solidarity, proof that even in scarcity, they were not alone. The memory of those food shortages lasted long after the snow melted. Older generations spoke of the taste of watery soups, of powdered eggs, of the rare joy of a fresh apple or slice of meat. They remembered the silence of queues, the careful counting of ration coupons, the disappointment of coming home empty-handed. Yet they also remembered the ingenuity of housewives, the kindness of neighbors, the determination to keep families fed despite the odds. For Britain as a whole, the struggle for food in 1947 highlighted the fragility of supply chains and the deep dependence on both agriculture and transport. It reminded people that even in peace, hardship could return with the force of nature. And it reinforced the lesson of the war years, that survival depended not only on individual effort, but on collective endurance. That in the end, spring came. The snow receded, fields reappeared, and lorries once again rumbled down cleared roads. Shops filled, slowly, with more reliable supplies. Yet the memory of that frozen winter lingered, of queues in the snow, of empty shelves, of meals cobbled together from whatever could be found. The winter of 1947 became a chapter not only in Britain's weather history, but in its social memory. A season when the nation learned anew the value of food, the pain of its absence, and the resilience required to endure its loss. If coal was the heartbeat of Britain during the frozen months of 1947, then water was its quiet lifeblood. In ordinary winters, people took its presence for granted, turning a tap in the kitchen, drawing a bucket from the village well, or filling a kettle without thought. But in that terrible winter, water became as precious, and sometimes as scarce, as food or fuel. Frost crept into pipes, wells froze at their rims, and the simple act of washing or boiling tea required an effort that stretched patience and strength. Cleanliness, never easy in an era of rationing, turned into a daily trial. Water systems of the mid-20th century were far less resilient than those we know today. Many houses in towns and cities were connected to municipal mains, but insulation was poor, and pipes often ran above ground or through unheated spaces. As temperatures sank and remained below freezing for weeks, pipes burst or clogged with ice. In working-class terraces, families awoke to taps that produced nothing more than a hollow wheeze. In cottages and farmhouses, buckets drawn from wells came up rimmed with thick ice. In some villages, pumps froze altogether, their handles stiff as iron. The response to such shortages was both simple and exhausting. Snow was gathered, hauled indoors, and melted on stoves or fires. It took vast quantities of snow to make a single bucket of water, and the process demanded precious fuel, itself scarce. Still, families knelt with pans, filling them from doorsteps or gardens, scooping up clean drifts where soot had not settled. Children were often sent out with buckets or basins, returning with heavy loads of snow that left their arms aching. The sound of dripping, as snow melted slowly in pots, became a background rhythm in many kitchens. Clean water was needed not only for drinking and cooking, but for hygiene. Here the difficulties became more acute. Bathing, already infrequent in many households during the austerity years, grew rarer still. Public baths, where entire communities once queued weekly for a hot soak, were sometimes closed due to lack of coal to heat the water. When they did open, they offered only lukewarm supplies, quickly exhausted by long lines of weary citizens. People improvised by washing piecemeal, warming a small basin of water by the fire and scrubbing hands, faces, or feet in turn. The phrase "a strip wash" was common, meaning a hurried rinse of the most necessary parts, often by candlelight in a cold bedroom. Laundry presented another formidable challenge. Washing clothes required far more water than was easily available, and soap supplies were limited. Families postponed laundry for as long as possible, wearing garments multiple times, airing them near the hearth, and darning or patching as needed. When washing could not be delayed, it was an arduous affair. Buckets filled with melted snow, kettles boiled one after another, clothes scrubbed by hand until fingers stung from cold. Lines strung across kitchens or sculleries held damp garments that never quite dried, stiffening instead in the chill. In some homes, frost formed on washing even as it hung indoors, a testimony to the depth of the cold in rural areas, where wells and pumps provided the main supply. Conditions were scarcely better. The depth of frost reached into the ground, freezing shallow wells. Farmers chopped through ice to water animals, while their families relied on buckets carried laboriously from springs or distant streams. Water had to be rationed carefully, used once for washing dishes, then again for cleaning floors, and finally poured out to dampen ashes. Nothing was wasted. Villagers sometimes organized communal efforts, with neighbors taking turns to draw water for several households. Sharing the burden of the long trudge through snow, the government, aware of the health risks, issued repeated warnings about hygiene. Newspapers reminded readers to wash hands regularly, even if only with cold water, to prevent the spread of illness. Advice columns suggested adding disinfectant to limited supplies or boiling snowmelt thoroughly before use. Yet these recommendations often felt impractical to those whose stoves barely produced heat, whose coal bins stood empty, or whose wells yielded nothing. Public health officers feared outbreaks of disease, and though there were localized cases of dysentery and other infections, widespread epidemics were avoided, thanks largely to the resilience and care of ordinary families. The memory of cleanliness, or rather the lack of it, colored people's recollections of 1947. Diaries spoke of the frustration of greasy hair, of fingernails blackened from shoveling coal or snow, of clothes that seemed never fully clean. Children remembered the smell of damp wool socks, steamed briefly over the fire. Housewives lamented the endless battle against soot, which clung to curtains and tablecloths yet could not be properly washed away. Pride in keeping a neat home suffered, replaced by a resigned acceptance that dirt and discomfort were unavoidable. Yet within these struggles were small triumphs. A successful hot bath, even shared among several family members, was remembered with gratitude. A clean shirt, pressed and aired by the hearth, lifted spirits for a day. A jug of clear water, fetched after hours of labor, was treasured as if it were gold. Families found ways to restore dignity in small acts of washing and tidying, even when the results were modest. Children often found humor where adults saw only frustration. They laughed as basins of snow were carried indoors, delighting in watching the heaps shrink to puddles. They played with icicles gathered from eaves, pretending they were swords or crystal treasures, while their parents saw only the evidence of another freeze. For the young, the scarcity of water was simply part of the adventure of winter. For their elders, it was a daily burden. The silence of towns, already deep, was amplified by the absence of running water. The familiar gurgle of pipes, the hiss of a kettle filled at the tap, the splash of baths or laundry, all were missing. Instead, houses echoed with the scrape of buckets, the crack of ice, and the drip, drip, drip of melting snow. It was a quieter, harsher domestic soundscape, one that etched itself into memory. Public institutions also faced challenges. Schools, when open, struggled to provide sanitation with frozen pipes. Buckets served in place of taps, and children washed reluctantly in cold water before meals. Hospitals faced the gravest difficulties of all: sterilizing equipment, washing linens, and maintaining hygiene in wards became monumental tasks without steady supplies. Nurses worked tirelessly, boiling water in endless kettles, improvising with limited resources. Their determination helped prevent outbreaks that could have devastated already weakened patients in the countryside. Wells eventually thawed as March progressed, but damage lingered. Broken pumps required repair, burst pipes demanded replacement, and entire systems had to be overhauled. In cities, water companies faced enormous repair bills, sending crews to mend mains cracked by frost. For weeks after the thaw, streets were marked by streams of leaking water as repairs lagged behind. The relief of running taps was tempered by the recognition of how fragile the system had proven under strain. The long-term memory of the winter of 1947 was tied not only to hunger and cold, but also to the sense of uncleanliness. Families spoke of never quite feeling fresh, of carrying the smell of smoke and damp clothing, of longing for the luxury of hot baths. Even years later, survivors recalled with pride the first proper soak they enjoyed once normal supplies returned, describing it as one of the finest comforts of peacetime. Cleanliness, then, was not merely a matter of hygiene. It was a measure of dignity, of control, of ordinary life. To wash one's hands, to bathe a child, to launder a shirt, these were acts that symbolized order in a disordered world. In 1947, when water froze and cleanliness slipped from reach, people discovered how much these small routines mattered. Their persistence in seeking them, in melting snow, in queuing at pumps, in boiling kettle after kettle, testified to the resilience of everyday life. The chapter of water and wells in the frozen winter of 1947 reminds us that survival is not only about warmth or food, but also about the quiet quest for cleanliness that sustains human dignity. It was a quest pursued in kitchens filled with melting snow, in farmyards with axes breaking ice, in schools and hospitals improvising against the cold. And it was a quest remembered long after, part of the collective story of how Britain endured those frozen months. The winter of 1947 reshaped the daily geography of Britain. Streets that had once bustled with footsteps, wheels, and the constant movement of buses and trams became almost unrecognizable. Snow fell in heavy, unrelenting layers. It buried pavements, muffled the sound of traffic, and rendered familiar routes impassable. What had been arteries of commerce and community were reduced to silent white corridors where progress was slow and uncertain. The nation, still fragile from years of war, found its movement halted by nature's quiet force. In ordinary times, British streets were alive with motion. London's buses carried workers from suburbs into the heart of the city. Trams in Manchester and Glasgow rattled along their rails. Bicycles clattered over cobblestones, ridden by clerks, shop assistants, and students. In villages, carts and lorries moved produce and coal, while in cities, black taxis and private cars threaded the roads. The soundtrack of daily life was the roar of engines, the clanging of tram bells, the chatter of footsteps. By February 1947, these sounds had dwindled. The snowfall, persistent and heavy, smothered the streets. Drifts piled up against doors, fences, and lampposts. Pavements vanished, leaving only uneven ridges of ice where people guessed the walkway might be. Roads froze into sheets of glassy white, treacherous even to the most careful pedestrian. Vehicles abandoned at the roadside became snow-covered mounds, their outlines barely visible. Entire streets were reduced to silence, save for the crunch of boots or the distant scrape of a shovel. For many, walking became the only option. Men and women trudged to work on foot, wrapped in scarves and overcoats, leaning into the bitter wind. Journeys that once took 20 minutes by tram now demanded an hour or more of careful, slippery walking. Children picked their way to school in groups, holding hands for balance, their satchels heavy on their backs. In villages, people carried shopping baskets through drifts that reached their waists, often returning home empty-handed after shops ran out of goods. Improvisation became essential. Handcarts, prams, and even sledges were pressed into service to carry food, coal, or water. Farmers in rural districts used horses to pull sledges loaded with hay or milk churns, while in towns, some residents strapped boxes to children's sledges to drag supplies home. Neighbors often joined together, one clearing a path while another carried provisions. Streets became places of cooperation as much as frustration, with groups of residents forming ad hoc teams to shovel their way toward main roads. Public transport fared little better than private effort. Tram lines froze solid, rails hidden beneath snow that could not be cleared fast enough. Buses skidded or stalled, their routes canceled day after day. Drivers struggled to keep engines running in the cold, while conductors faced angry passengers forced to wait in icy queues. Some cities suspended entire routes, leaving districts cut off. In rural areas, buses disappeared altogether, and people were left to rely on whatever means they could muster. The railways, vital to the life of the nation, were perhaps the most striking casualty of the snow. Tracks disappeared under drifts several feet high, and points and switches froze so solidly that they could not be moved. Engines stood idle in depots, their fires extinguished for lack of coal. When trains did attempt to run, they often became stuck, stranded between stations while passengers huddled in freezing carriages. Newspaper photographs captured scenes of men with shovels digging out locomotives buried almost to their funnels. Special snowplow engines were deployed, but even these could not keep pace with the relentless storms. The paralysis of the railways carried consequences far beyond passengers. Coal, food, and other supplies that depended on rail transport piled up at depots and ports, unable to move inland. Factories waiting for deliveries shut their doors. Shops ran out of goods. Villages found themselves isolated for weeks, their connection to the wider world severed by the simple inability of trains to move. Letters and parcels, too, vanished into the backlog, leaving families without news or comfort from distant relatives. Air travel, still rare and limited in 1947, was almost entirely suspended. Runways vanished under snow, and the idea of reliable flight seemed fanciful against the scale of the winter. Coastal shipping fared little better. Harbors froze, and inland canals offered no relief. Britain, an island built on connection and movement, seemed suddenly cut off from itself. For pedestrians, the frozen streets became both obstacle and theater. Children enjoyed the novelty, sliding on pavements polished into ice rinks, their laughter echoing against silent houses. Adults, less enchanted, slipped and stumbled, often returning home with bruises or twisted ankles. Hospitals reported an increase in such injuries, adding to their already heavy burden. Yet walking remained the only option, and people adjusted, tying cloth over boots for extra grip, carrying sticks for balance, or simply accepting the slowness of each step. The silence of travel was profound. Streets once filled with the growl of buses and the clatter of trams now echoed only with the sound of boots on snow. Cities, stripped of their usual din, seemed subdued, their outlines softened by white. Rural lanes were stiller still, broken only by the occasional neigh of a horse or the creak of a sledge. Many recalled that it felt as if the entire nation had been muted, its voice stolen by the weather. Newspapers captured these scenes with both drama and resignation. Photographs showed streets lined with abandoned cars, trams frozen in place, queues of people walking along railway tracks in search of movement. Headlines spoke of paralysis, of towns cut off, of entire counties reduced to silence. Yet editorials often urged patience, reminding readers that endurance was as necessary on the streets as it was in the home. For individuals, the memory of travel in 1947 was marked by effort. Teachers recalled trudging for miles to reach schools, only to find them closed. Workers remembered walking to factories that stood idle for lack of power. Families described carrying prams laden with coal, groceries, or even children through snowbound streets. Some remembered the eerie sight of London's normally bustling thoroughfares reduced to near emptiness, with only a handful of figures moving against the backdrop of white. The frozen streets also changed social life. Visits to neighbors, cinemas, or pubs dwindled when the journey itself became hazardous. Many chose to remain indoors, leading to quieter evenings, darker towns, and a sense of isolation. For some, the silence was peaceful, a rare pause in otherwise busy lives. For others, it was oppressive, a reminder of how easily normal life could be suspended. By March, when thaw finally began, the streets revealed the scars of their ordeal. Roads cracked from frost, pavements chipped by endless shoveling, vehicles damaged beyond repair. The return of traffic was greeted with relief, but also with a new awareness of fragility. For weeks, Britain had walked slowly, stumbled often, and learned again how dependent it was on movement. The memory of frozen streets and silent travel lingered long after the snow melted. People spoke of the crunch of boots, the endless trudge through drifts, the sight of trams standing still like statues. They recalled the exhaustion of journeys that once seemed effortless, the bruises from falls, the cold that seeped into every step. Yet they also remembered the resilience, the neighbors who cleared paths together, the children who turned hardship into play, the quiet dignity with which the nation walked through its frozen weeks. In the great story of the winter of 1947, the streets stand as symbols of stillness. They were the places where silence met movement, where Britain learned to endure slowness, to accept difficulty, and to keep walking, step by careful step, through snow that seemed never to end. The winter of 1947 did not only freeze Britain's streets and fields, it froze the very rhythm of life itself. Ordinary routines, which had seemed so steady even during the years of war, suddenly broke apart under the endless snow and bitter cold. Children who were used to waking to the sound of school bells stayed home. Workers who had marched each morning toward mills, factories, and offices were sent back to their kitchens with nothing to do. Shopkeepers who had always opened their doors at the same hour found themselves closing early, their shelves bare and their counters cold. It was a season of suspension when the ordinary measures of time, school days, work days, weekends, blurred into one long stretch of waiting. For school children, the disruption was both strange and memorable. Schools across towns and villages closed when coal supplies dwindled and heating failed. In those that remained open, classrooms were bitterly cold, their high windows rimmed with frost and their wooden desks icy to the touch. Pupils sat in overcoats, gloves, and woolen scarves, their breaths forming clouds as they tried to copy lessons into exercise books. Teachers pressed on bravely, but lessons were shortened, reading and recitation replacing writing when ink froze in inkwells. In many places, attendance fell to almost nothing, as snowdrifts blocked lanes and families kept their children at home rather than risk long, frozen walks. Some children welcomed the freedom, their days filled with sledging and snowball fights, but the novelty faded as weeks passed. With food scarce and houses freezing, they discovered that being home was not always a holiday. The lives of adults were no less disturbed. Workplaces across the nation struggled to function. Coal shortages silenced the steel mills, the textile looms, and the heavy machinery of factories. Office clerks found their typewriters stiff with cold, while managers shortened hours to conserve electricity or sent staff away altogether. Thousands of workers faced layoffs, their wages interrupted, their days filled with uncertainty. Shops, too, lost their rhythm. Without deliveries, counters were bare, and with heating restricted, most closed earlier than usual. Customers, chilled and weary, queued in silence for whatever bread, tea, or vegetables might arrive. When goods ran out, they turned home again, baskets empty, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The result of these closures was an unfamiliar abundance of time. Families spent more hours together than at any point since before the war, but in houses that were often one-room warm at best, togetherness could strain nerves as much as it brought comfort. Morning routines shifted. No rush to school, no commute to work, only the slow process of lighting a fire if coal could be spared and preparing a meager breakfast. Afternoons dragged, filled with small tasks of survival, melting snow for water, chopping wood, patching clothes, or queuing at shops. Children fetched buckets, carried kindling, or read books beneath blankets. Adults worried over ration books, discussed rumors of coal deliveries, or tried to keep spirits alive with stories and games. Evenings, once filled with visits to cinemas, dances, or pubs, shrank to quiet gatherings around a fading fire. Electricity cuts dimmed lights, radios fell silent, and families played cards, read aloud, or sat simply in conversation. For some, these evenings were remembered fondly as times of unity. For others, they were stretches of boredom broken only by the whistle of the wind at the door. This sense of time suspended was perhaps the hardest to bear. In diaries and letters, people wrote of days blending together, of living hour by hour, of waiting endlessly. The steady march of work weeks and school terms had given structure to life. Without them, hours stretched long and shapeless. Some people turned to hobbies long neglected, mending furniture, knitting socks, or writing letters. Others simply endured in silence, watching frost creep across windows and listening for the rare rumble of a lorry on the road. A few found humor in the situation, joking that they had been granted an unexpected holiday. Though the joke rang hollow when hunger and cold pressed too close, the press and government worked hard to encourage discipline and patience. Newspapers offered advice columns on keeping children busy indoors, cooking creative meals from scarce supplies, and conserving fuel. Radio broadcasts praised the enduring spirit of the people, comparing their patience to the resilience shown during the war. Yet for those huddled in icy kitchens or trudging through snow to shuttered shops, such words felt far away. What mattered was not encouragement, but survival. Keeping warm, keeping fed, keeping routines alive in whatever small way they could. Memories of the time are filled with both weariness and small triumphs. A family who managed to sit down to a hot meal after days of thin soups recalled it with pride. A child who returned to school after weeks at home remembered the joy of seeing friends again, even in a freezing classroom. A worker recalled the relief of hearing his factory whistle once more, signaling that power had returned. These small returns to normality reminded people that the interruption, though long, would not last forever when spring finally came. Schools reopened, factories restarted, and shops filled slowly with goods once more. Children settled back at desks, adults returned to machines, and families regained the rhythm of ordinary days. Yet the memory of those interrupted routines lingered. People remembered the silence of mornings without work, the strange emptiness of afternoons without school, the dark evenings filled only with candlelight and waiting. They remembered, too, the patience with which they endured, the creativity with which they filled their days, and the quiet strength that carried them through. The winter of 1947 was not just a story of snow and cold. It was a story of disrupted lives and suspended time. Schools, work, and routines, the very patterns that give life meaning, were broken. And yet, in their place, families discovered resilience. The interruption was painful, but it was endured, and when the thaw came, the routines returned, carrying with them a new appreciation for the ordinary rhythm of daily life. The winter of 1947 has lived on in memory not because of any single event, but because of how completely it touched the lives of ordinary people. It was not a storm that passed in a day or a week, but a long, grinding season of snow and silence, of hunger and cold, of waiting and enduring. For weeks, Britain became an island within itself, its fields hidden, its trains stalled, its shops bare, its homes shivering in darkness. Families gathered closer, neighbors lent hands and shared what little they had, and communities discovered strength in small acts of kindness. When the thaw finally came, it revealed not just the damage left behind, fields scarred, flocks lost, houses strained, but also the resilience of a nation that had endured once again. The people who lived through it remembered the endless queues, the frost on windows, the silence of streets, and the struggle for food, water, and warmth. But they also remembered the laughter of children on sledges, the determination of workers digging out trains, the neighbor who appeared with a loaf of bread or a bucket of coal, the nurse who trudged for miles to reach a sick patient. History often records wars and politics, but the winter of 1947 is remembered for its quiet battles. The battle to keep a fire burning, the battle to fetch water from a frozen pump, the battle to put food on the table, the battle to endure another night of cold. It is a story not of leaders or armies, but of millions of ordinary lives, pressed by hardship, yet carried forward with patience. And now, as we close this journey through Britain's frozen months, let the story settle like snow itself, soft, quiet, and steady. The people of 1947 endured, and so too did their memories, teaching later generations what it means to persist through stillness and cold. May their story remind us of the strength found in simplicity, of the resilience and patience, and of the calm that can be carried even through the hardest of winters. O rest now. With the thought of snow gently falling outside, a nation hushed and families gathered close for warmth. The winter of 1947 has ended, its silence preserved only in memory. And as you drift into sleep, let that silence guide you into dreams of stillness, patience, and quiet endurance.